this is the GRE info session. Again, please register if you haven't already to get the recording of the session along with these slides. It looks like we have a question. Will you share the slides? Yes. So if you have already registered and you said that you wanted them ahead, I believe I sent that out around 3 today, so you should already have an email with the slides. But if not, then you can always register for the slides at the end. And we will be posting this within a few days on the college YouTube account as well. So once we have that, we'll be sending both the video out with the slides again. And then we can go ahead and get started with the other parts of the presentation. So to start off, what is the GRE? It's also known as the Graduate Records Exam. It is the most widely used graduate exam. So other options like the GMAT or the LSAT are not used as widely as the GRE, but many prospective graduate and business school applicants that are interested in doing a master's, an MBA, a law, or other PhD doctoral degree will take the GRE. That's become fairly common. Most MBA programs use it, and quite a few law programs now are using it as well. It is a computer-based exam, so most people will take the computer-based exam, but if you had specific needs which required you to use a paper-based exam, there are some paper-based options, but you will need to find a specific testing center and get disability accommodations ahead of time. So if you need disability accommodations, those are posted here on that link, ets.org/GRE/revised_general registered disabilities. So there's a lot of information there. I highly recommend looking over that for your accommodations, as well as the general bulletin for disability needs, which you can see here for also on ets.org. They are the main people who run the test, and they have information about if you have disabilities, what you can use. A lot of times, one of the most common disability accommodations they'll give is extra time, which you'll see there's not a ton of time for the total test. There's 3 hours and 45 minutes for 6 different sections, which is pretty quick through each section. So if you qualify, then you definitely should take the extra time. And it's a myth that they won't take it as seriously. Some people think that if you have accommodations that will discount your score in some way, but that won't be the case. They won't even necessarily mention that you got accommodations depending on what those accommodations are for your test. So I strongly encourage doing that. And then as far as when to take the test, November is a common time, not necessarily because it's the best time, but often students are trying to take it in November because their applications are due in December. Once you take the test, you're waiting 15 days to get the results, and you can take the test every 21 days up to 5 times within a continuous 12-month period. So you could take it potentially 5 times in a year. Most people will only take it once, maybe twice. Only 1 in 4 actually retake the test. So keep that in mind, that you might want to have some time for a retake, but you don't necessarily have to take it so early that you're expecting to take it multiple times before your application. And you can take it anytime. There's not certain times of the month that you can take it. Really almost any day, especially weekdays, you can take the exam. We'll talk later about how you can take the exam from home. And currently you can take the exam literally any day of the week at almost any time of the day, depending on what the availability is at the testing center. So it's very flexible when you take it. As far as signing up for it, you could sign up for it as soon as 2 days from now. So there's a lot of flexibility, but think about when you're signing up of where you would want to take it, especially if you're taking it at a testing center. You could look and see what centers are open, if those times and also those locations work for you, or else you might need to travel a good while from where you're starting from to get at the testing center. Summer is another really common time, so a lot of students will study for it over the summer and then take it towards the end of the summer. I would say that's a really good option. especially so that you have another chance to take it and maybe you're not trying to study for the exam while also working on your other courses. And of course, the main thing to do would be to think about when you'll need to apply. If you're hoping for first round applications, some of those might even be due in September or October. You'll need to think about how long you'll need to take the exam before those applications are due, and use that as a basis to work backwards for when you would take the exam. A lot of people also will take a gap year before they apply to graduate school, and it's encouraged to potentially take this right after you graduate or fairly soon after you graduate, and not necessarily take it right before you apply to these programs. Generally, they find that students often do better because they're in a testing mode, they're used to taking tests pretty soon after they graduate, and then after it's been a few years, maybe you haven't taken many classes, you might not be as familiar with the kinds of multiple choice exam questions that could come up on the exam. And generally the test is good for 5 years. Most schools will recognize an exam that's taken within the last 5 years. So you could take it a year or two after you graduate and then still use it for up to potentially 5 years for when that application is due. Okay, and then feel free to continue to put any questions in the Q&A as you have them. And then we'll go over the different sections of the test. So as I mentioned, it is a computer-based exam. Oops. For the test, there are 3 main components. There is a verbal reasoning, which has 2 sections, a quantitative reasoning with 2 sections, and an analytical writing, as well as an unscored or research section, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the analytical writing is what will start off your test for the computer-based exam. They have both analyze an issue and analyze an argument, and you get 30 minutes per task. So this will be all based off of a typed essay. You are expected to write a full 4-paragraph or so essay for those 30 minutes. So you can see that it's not quite a lot of time, but we'll go over some general strategies for that section. And then for the verbal reasoning, there's 2 sections of that, 20 questions per section, 30 minutes to finish that. In the verbal reasoning, you'll have both vocabulary and passage-based questions for 30 minutes. And in the quantitative reasoning, 2 sections of that, 20 questions per section for 35 minutes. Now the caveat with this unscored or research section is that sometimes they have a research section which focuses on some other questions that they're testing out, but generally it's most common that you get the traditional unscored section, which is going to be an additional verbal or quantitative reasoning section that is not scored. And this is not necessarily coming at the end. So how you'll know if one was unscored is if you get 3 quantitative sections, one of those was unscored, but it could be the first quantitative reasoning section you get, or the second, or the third. It could be any of the sections that you took. Similarly, if you get 3 verbal reasoning sections, one of those was unscored, but it could be any of the ones. It's not necessarily the last one you take, so you do have to do well on each section. The test is also adaptive, which is a bit confusing, but how it's adaptive is that within each section, the questions are all of equal difficulty, and you can answer them in any order. You can flag them and come back later. You don't have to do them strictly in order. But once you finish a section, they will use your performance on an earlier section to determine how difficult they make the second section of that same type. So what that means is on the verbal reasoning, the first time you take the verbal reasoning section, and let's say it's a scored section, if you do quite well, you'll get a more difficult verbal reasoning section for your second section. If you do quite well on the quantitative, similarly, you'll get a more difficult section for the next one. If you don't do as well in the first section, they might give you an easier or similarly difficult second section. And in order to maximize your score, that means that you have to do quite well on your first section of that type to then get the more difficult questions on the second type. If you do poorly, then they will potentially give you easier questions that might not allow you to score as highly total for the full GRE for that particular quantitative or verbal reasoning. For the analytical writing, it is not iterative. They aren't necessarily grading that as you submit this. So that is not iterative, but it does have some adaptability within the sections. Any questions on that? I don't think I see any in the Q&A, but I know that can be confusing on how the test adapts. Okay, so we can go on to the next section. So we'll talk first about the verbal reasoning. So there's three main parts of the verbal reasoning. There is reading comprehension, and that has passages that are drawn from the physical, biological, and social sciences, arts and humanities, and generally other everyday topics. They have within that section multiple choice, where you select one answer, multiple choice where you select multiple answers, and also a select in passage option. Looks like we have a question. Oh, it's on the previous section. I'll answer that now. Yes, so what does it mean? Yeah, I think I might have been a little confusing there, but so I was specifically, the question was, what does it mean generally when we say that the analytical writing, I believe, is not iterative? And that might not be the right word, but what I'm trying to say is the analytical writing, you don't get a more difficult prompt for the second section of the analytical writing. They don't score that automatically. So the analytical writing, how you do on the analyze the issue or the argument, that won't affect how what type of questions you get on the second analytical writing prompt. And then for verbal reasoning, so that's basically the reading comprehension, and we'll go over some examples of what reading comprehension looks like. Then for text completion, they have a passage composed of 1 to 5 sentences, usually only a couple, with 1 to 3 blanks. So if there's 3 answer choices per blank, there's either 3 answer choices per blank or 5 answer choices if there's a single blank. And we'll show some examples of that. And then there's also sentence equivalence, which is most similar to the previous mentioned text completion. It's also vocabulary based. So it's a single sentence with 1 blank, and there's 6 answer choices, and then you're selecting 2 answer choices within that. So we'll go over some examples. This is an example of a passage. So I'll read the passage. Reviving the practice of using elements of popular music in classical composition, an approach that has been in hibernation in the United States during the 1960s. Composer Philip Glass, born in 1937, embraced the ethos of popular music in his composition. Glass based 2 symphonies on music by rock musicians David Bowie and Brian Eno, but the symphony's sound is distinctively his. Popular elements do not appear out of place in Glass's classical music, which from its early days has shared certain harmonies and rhythms with rock music. Yet this use of popular elements has not made Glass a composer of popular music. His music is not a version of popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It is a high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics. So this is what you might see for a typical passage. This is generally the difficulty of writing, and many of these questions for verbal reasoning, especially for these passage-based questions, are based on generally understanding the passage. So if you feel like you have enough time, it is good to read the passage before answering some of the questions to get a good idea of what some of the main ideas are, what the author believes about the general person or theme that they're talking about, and to get a big picture overview of what they're covering. And then here's an example of what I mentioned for that option where they have select multiple answers. So whenever they select multiple, it will say 3 answer choices, and you are to select all that apply. So here's an example of that. says consider each of the three choices separately, select all that apply. The passage suggests that glasses' work displays which of the following qualities: a return to the use of popular music in classical compositions, an attempt to elevate rock music to an artistic status more closely approximating that of classical music, and a long-standing tendency to incorporate elements from two apparently separate music styles. So the correct answer here is the first choice and third choice. You can see that some of these questions, they are tricky, but you are to use your logic and you are to infer only based off of what the particular author said, not what you think they might believe, only what you can find evidence for these particular sections. So really think about what you can deduce based off just what they mentioned. And definitely read the questions carefully and refer back to the passage for proof, especially for these particular types of questions. And then here we'll go on to another example of a text completion. So here for text completion, these are based off of vocabulary. And so here we have an example: vain and prone to violence, Caravaggio could not handle success. The more his blank as an artist increased, the more blank his life became. So here you're expected to select one answer from the first blank, one answer from the second blank. We can see that you are supposed to select C and D for this. If you select one blank correctly but the other incorrectly, then there is no partial credit. So you have to select the entire blank correct, the entire choices correctly to get the question correct and to get the points for that question. And all the questions are weighted equally, so keep that in mind, as some questions are a little more difficult than others based just on the amount of options they provide. And then generally for these text completions, it's good to think of, for the blanks, how the two blanks relate to each other. So we can see in this question it says the more blank as an artist increased, the more blank his life became. We can see that these would be potentially opposites. And that's good to think of even before you see the answer choices, is how would these two blanks relate to each other? Would they be opposites, synonyms? How could you choose amongst the different blank options for those? It's also good to never eliminate words just because you don't know them. If you feel like it could fit, then maybe that would be the choice you have, but really think carefully about if the word you're choosing would be a good fit based off of the sentence. And generally you want to think about, you want a common sentence structure. So cliches are very common in these questions. It's not going to be something that sounds a little hard to understand or is maybe like an untypical idea. They are trying to use the main definitions of these words in a typical manner. So they're not necessarily trying to trick you with these questions. Go with what makes the best sense for the sentence. Then here we have an example of sentence equivalence. So we can see here the macromolecule RNA is common to all living beings, and DNA, which is found in all organisms except bacteria, is almost as blank. So we can see some general clues again in these early on of what we might be looking for in the blank. We can see that they're talking about something that's potentially a synonym with common here. So we're looking for that with our answer choices. And then we can see that based off of this, universal and ubiquitous would have the same meaning within the sentence. So those might not be outright synonyms, but they have the same meaning within the sentence itself, and that's what you are supposed to do for sentence equivalence. So for sentence equivalence, it's good to both potentially pair up the answer choices into pairs that you think are close enough to be potentially synonyms in certain contexts, but also to use those same context clues you would use for the text completion to think about what the sentence might be looking for that particular answer choice. Any other questions about the verbal reasoning? And then generally you're always looking for any structural signs. So since, however, because most of these questions will give you a leading in option like this. So they'll say like the macromolecule RNA is common to all living beings. Technically the sentence would have still worked if they said DNA, which is found in all organisms, is almost as blank, but they want to give you some hints ahead for most of these questions of what that could look like. Okay, we can go on then to the next types of questions, which would be quantitative reasoning. So there's going to be 4 main content types. You can find all the information about these content types at the ETS website, so ets/GRE/revised_general, prepare, and then quantitative reasoning. And then again, these slides will be sent out to your email within a few days after the presentation. So for quantitative reasoning, there's 4 content types. There is arithmetic, which is generally elementary school math, would be the best way to describe it, fairly easy math. Then algebra, which is mostly up to just algebra 1. And then for geometry, it's pretty basic geometry, used in classes later, geometry that's used in other classes like algebra 2, but no proofs or fancy theorems for the geometry. And then data analysis, which is basic statistics and complete familiarity with lots of tables and graphs. So for quantitative comparison, this is an example of what some of the questions will be like for your quantitative reasoning section. So they will start off with quantitative comparison, generally like 6 or so quantitative comparison questions at the start. And remember, you have 20 questions on each quantitative reasoning section. So they'll start with this general format, which is quantity A is larger, quantity B is larger, they are the same, or the relationship cannot be determined. Those are the 4 answer choices that are common in all quantitative comparisons. And you'll be given a quantity A and a quantity B to determine which is larger, are they the same, or can you not determine the relationship. So here's an example that says these items require you to compare 2 expressions and determine the relation between their values. If a determinate relation exists, we can see here a circle O with a triangle AOB with its center at O. And it says the perimeter of AOB is 6. So you're asked, is the circumference of the circle greater, or is the quantity 12 bigger? So basically, is the circumference greater than or less than 12? And you can see from these types of questions, you might not be able to actually determine an exact value for quantity A in some situations, but you can still try to see if it's greater than or less than 12. So for this particular question, we can see here that the circumference of the circle would be 2 pi r. 2 pi times roughly 2 would be greater than 12. So here we have the exact quantity. We know that quantity A is larger, but never say that it's just the relationship cannot be determined unless you don't have enough information to even say if quantity A or B is larger. And then, any questions about that so far? Generally, what you should know about the math is some of these questions are quite tricky in that you might think that they're asking for one thing, but based off their particular language, they are looking for something else. So I would definitely say read over these questions, especially at least twice, to make sure you fully understand the question, you fully understand the relationships with all the diagrams they provide for these questions. And then it's generally similar questions to other competition-like math. So if you've done things like the Mendelbrot or the AMC 10, those are the types of questions you'll see here. There will never be a question that will ask you to solve for something like X. It will never be that straightforward. You'll generally be asked to use information to synthesize new information, and find a relationship between things. So it's up to you to find out what information is important, what do you need to do to solve the problem. which can be a bit challenging, and that's why it's good to practice on these types of questions to understand how to solve them. You also do get a calculator for the entirety of the quantitative reasoning section, which you really don't need for most questions. So it should be limited. You'll only need it for really a couple of questions, especially those with percentages. If you find that you're working with really difficult numbers, that's probably not what they were hoping you would do for the problem. There's likely another solution to the problem that might be a little simpler. And again, they're not expecting you to use any calculus or difficult algebra. There shouldn't be any algebra 2. So overall, the types of math, it's easier types of math than what you might see on the SAT, but it is asking you to think a little more critically. So that would be something important to think about for these types of questions. Any questions about that? And then we can go on to some other options. So similar to the verbal reasoning, for quantitative reasoning, there are some questions that ask you to select multiple answers. Unlike verbal reasoning, these might have potentially 6 or 7 options. So we can see an example here where it says each employee of a certain company is either in Department X or Department Y, and there are more than twice as many employees in Department X as Department Y. The average or arithmetic mean salary is $2,500 for the employees in Department X and $35,000 for the employees in Department Y. Which of the following amounts could be the average salary for all the employees of the company? So here you're asked to indicate all such amounts. For this particular question, you are choosing the first 2. For some of these types of questions, you would want to look at if you could find all the answers within a range of choices. That's ideal. Some of these will be all of the answers within a certain range of options. But there are some questions, like this one, for example, where you would actually have to try all different integers. So we can see here another example of when there's multiple choices where it says which of the following integers are multiples of both 2 and 3. For this, you might have to look at every single answer choice to see whether that is a multiple of both 2 and 3, and then choose all of the options for that. Then here we can see another answer option here, which is both what they would show for one of their data questions with a table. There are going to be a few tables on the test, and also a question that asks you to write in your own answer. So all of these answers will be to the nearest 0.1%. It's most common for answers here to not be too tricky. A lot of these questions will ask you for whole number answers for the most part. But you can see that these can be especially difficult to potentially guess on, but they also really, if you are not too sure on these might be something you want to skip and just write in a best guess answer, because there really isn't a lot to narrow down for these questions. And that's another general point. There isn't any penalty for wrong answers for the whole test, so never leave any of the questions blank. Give a best guess for them. If you have time, try to narrow it down a little, but if not, think about what likelihood you have of just getting the answers correct for those, and focus on getting as many points as possible with the limited time you have. All right, any questions on that so far? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So we can see here, this is also asking again for a question that's not quite as straightforward. You're using 2 different parts of the table. None of the table questions will ask you to just read something off the table. You will have to do some calculations for all of their questions. And then here for analytical writing, we'll get into the writing section if there's not any other questions. So for both of the analytical writing passages, it's important to read over the main question, the main parts of it a good number of times, and they'll always present you with the main with this similar prompt at the start, which says, read an issue and present a compelling argument for your own position. Read directions carefully. Those are the common instructions for all of these. And then it will give you the main part of the prompt, which is, in any field of endeavor, it is impossible to make significant contributions without first being strongly influenced by past achievements within that field. Write a response in which you discuss the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement and explain your reasoning for the position. In developing and supporting your position, you should consider ways in which the statement might or might not hold true and explain how these considerations shape your position. So specifically for the analyze an issue, it will give this type of common lead-in and instructions for the prompt. All of the prompts that they could potentially ask you are available on the ETS website, so you can see the full list of potential analyze an issue prompts and analyze an argument prompts on there, but there are a few hundred, so you probably won't have necessarily experience writing a specific essay, but it is good to look over what they could potentially ask you. And then for any of these analyze an issue prompts, it's good to potentially take a nuanced position, or at least show that you've considered the other's point of view. That will be a main thing they're looking for in your response. And then generally for both the analyze an issue and analyze an argument, you're looking to have at least 4 paragraphs ideally. If you can have 5, that's great, but if you can only produce a solid 4 paragraphs with a good conclusion, that's better than having a thin 5th paragraph or a essay that's not completely finished. So keep that in mind because you only get 30 minutes for this. You'll generally want to approach both parts of the analytical writing with a few minutes to come up with a general outline and a thesis point that you're going to have. They will be looking for a clear thesis position that directly addresses the prompt. And then you'll want to think for the analyze an issue of what kinds of evidence you might present. So think generally of some common examples you might use. If you have examples from your own life, you could use that. If you have, sometimes for some of these analyze an issue, it might be asking for things related to education. So if you have some of your own examples, or if you can think of particular issues that could be related, that would be good. But a lot of times it's good to think of general examples throughout history, general stories that you can refer to how that might relate to these particular prompts. So specifically for these prompts, a lot of this will focus on achievement. So if you can think of any particular past achievements or people that you would want to reference, that could be good for this particular prompt. Any questions there? Looks like we do have a question here. Do we have to choose a position? Can we give 50-50? Yes, you can choose a middle ground point. You'll want it to be a clear position, but you definitely can take a middle ground approach. So for this type of prompt where it says like, in any endeavor, it is impossible to make significant contribution without first being strongly influenced by past achievements, you might say that that all contributions are based off of the knowledge of others within the field and that nothing comes in a vacuum, but for significant achievements, there is a novel perspective that the inventor might need to take. That could be like an example where you're not 100% saying that it's impossible to achieve a contribution, but you're bringing in some potential caveats. And you'll see that that might be more easy to come up with a nuanced position depending on other prompts. Generally, all of the prompts will be very straightforward and linear. So you will see some other examples of an analyze an issue. So here's another one where it says, educational institutions have a responsibility to dissuade students from pursuing fields of study in which they are unlikely to succeed. That's a very clear statement without really a lot of nuance. And it's fine to say, yes, they should encourage students to pursue fields in which they're most likely to succeed and have success, but they but it is not their responsibility necessarily to dissuade students. So it's fine to take a middle ground position. You just want to support that position and have a clear position for it. And that's one of the main things they're looking for. So thank you for that question. Any other questions on analyze an issue? Okay, so we can go on to the next one, which is the analyze an argument section. So here for these general questions, we have an example here, but all of these will have obvious logical flaws for the analyze an argument. They will present a narrative with obvious logical flaws based off of the people in the narrative. And it's up to you to find the particular logic issues within that narrative. So we can see here, discuss the logical soundness of the author's case by critically examining the line of reasoning and use of evidence. Where it says here, over the past 2 years, the number of shoppers in Central Plaza has been steadily decreasing while the popularity of skateboarding has increased dramatically. Many Central Plaza store owners believe that the decrease in their business is due to the number of skateboard users in the plaza. There's also been a dramatic increase in the amount of litter and vandalism throughout the plaza. Thus, we recommend that the city prohibit skateboarding in Central Plaza. If skateboarding is prohibited here, we predict that business in Central Plaza will return to its previously high levels. So we can see here an example. There were some real logical leaps, and that's true for any of the analyze and argument sections. And then it asks you to write a response in which you discuss what questions would need to be answered in order to decide whether the recommendation is likely to have the predicted result. Be sure to explain how the answers to these questions would help to evaluate the recommendation. This is common for what it will ask you for the prompt, or it might say, analyze this particular argument. Do you agree with the conclusions? Are the conclusions valid? So generally for these types of sections, you'll pretty much always say no. There are some logical issues. A lot of these, it will be a correlation is not equal to causation issue, and that will be something you bring up, but you'll want to pick apart the specific areas where they had a leap in logic and they would need to find some other information. And it's good to generally end with that you would need more information to make a decision, that you might need to run an experiment or a test in certain areas to get more information. They're looking for you to see that these types of leaps, although they might happen in the real world, are not necessarily something that should be happening within, especially like these fields of science that you might be going into with what you would be using the GRE for. Any questions about analyze an argument? It is a pretty unique type of passage to the GRE, so you might not have very much familiarity with it, but it is quite straightforward for how you would write it. You're generally looking for 3 or so, 2 or 3 issues that the author has, and some other potential explanations or some other information they would need. Any questions there? Now we can go into scores. So scores, your score between 130 and 170 on both verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning, with 170 being the best. For analytical writing, you're scored between a 0 and 6. As long as you turn something in, you're getting at least probably a 1 on the analytical writing, but technically 0 through 6 for if you left it blank. And the scores are available officially 10 to 15 days after your test date, but you actually get what your scores might be for verbal and quantitative reasoning moments after you finish the test. So you'll get a preview of what those scores could be like. These might not be the final scores if they find there was an issue with some of the questions based off of some user feedback, or if they find that there was other issues that day with the software. There could be some changes, but that will generally be your score, and it's fairly accurate because those parts are scored automatically. And then the analytical writing, that is scored by 2 independent readers, and if they disagree significantly, they might have a 3rd reader to break a tie for that score. So that is what you're waiting for them to read over that analytical writing and give you a score based off of a real reader's reading your passages. And then on test day itself, you are able to send up to 4 free score reports to colleges of your choice. So you can, if you know already what schools you're applying to, you can select to send it then, or you could always send those later on, but there might be potentially some costs for that. And then the score of 150 is average for verbal, and 153 is average for the quantitative section. So that by average, it's 50th percentile for those. So roughly 50% score less than 150, roughly 50% higher. For really competitive programs, you are looking to be closer to that 170. For quantitative reasoning, you're looking right around 170 specifically. For verbal reasoning, maybe more like 165, 167, but still quite a good score. And scores of 3.5 on writing is considered average, but a more exceptional score would be 5 or 6 on the analytical writing. So if your program specifically cares about that section, that's what they're looking for. And for more information on interpreting your score, I strongly suggest going to this particular PDF. So ets.org/s/GRE/PDF/GRE interpreting scores PDF. There it'll give you the general breakdowns of the exact averages for all of these, as well as what a typical score would look like for certain fields. So if you're looking at business, or if you're looking at potentially a more science-based program, they will say what the typical scores are for those and what they would expect, because as you can imagine, an engineering-based program might care a lot based off of your quantitative score, but not as much for your verbal score, whereas an English program might care more about the verbal and analytical writing and not as much on the quantitative. Any questions on scoring? Okay, so then we could go to some specific updates for COVID-19. So many areas have test centers open right now. You can register for the test as soon as 2 days from now currently. I looked at least the general Berkeley area, and there's quite a few tests available, although for some of them you might have to travel to Sacramento if you're looking just 2 days out. But there's a number of testing centers around this particular Berkeley area that have lots of availability, at least within the next month. So you just don't necessarily have to sign up with a huge lead time, but maybe a week or 2 in advance if you want to sign up for a particular location. Testing is also allowed at home now with restrictions, which we'll get into more, and there is live proctoring on those. It's also available round the clock every day through December 31st, 2020. So they have committed until then to allow at-home testing, and then they'll be reevaluating after December 31st whether they want to continue to allow at-home testing. They do also have subject tests, which we haven't gone over today. This is just the general test, but subject tests are not available at home, and those have been canceled at least for October. And then also you should be aware that a lot of graduate schools are waiving the GRE at least for this year, if not going forward. So that is something to consider. You'll want to look over your schools again and see if they actually need the GRE, because you might not necessarily need to take it. And then some other restrictions for specifically at-home testing. So all these restrictions are available again on ets.org for their at-home equipment. Some of the big restrictions are you can't take the test in mainland China or Iran, and there's other countries might be temporarily restricted. I think most of those are open though. You must use specifically a computer with Windows or Mac with a relatively current operating system. You must have a speaker and microphone with no headphones, so speaker and microphone system. You have to have a camera that's either built-in or a webcam. You must be alone in the room with no food or a drink. Your ears must be visible at all times. That's just again to make sure no AirPods or headphones. You must have a whiteboard with an erasable marker or a paper with a sheet protector and an erasable marker that you can erase. and have a standard chair. So they made this so that this is generally doable for at home, but make sure you have the ability to have this type of a setup as well as all these materials if you're planning on doing an at-home test. And then again, there's also tests available at other proctoring centers. Now for the resources, and one of the best places to start with would be eop.berkeley.edu/GRE-grad. They have their GRE fee reduction certificate, which is 50% off the test, which is normally $205 potentially. That's at least what I looked at a few days ago was the current price. So that could save you a good amount of money if you are eligible for that fee reduction certificate. But generally on that page from EOP, they have a lot of other information of other resources, other programs that they offer. So they offer other programs and tests, resources. They have a big selection of potential practice tests. So I definitely suggest going there for a first look of other resources that are offered. Then we have a question, what is the whiteboard for? We'll get to that in a minute. And then for the UC Berkeley Office for Graduate Diversity, that's another good program to look at if you're applying to grad school. It's a full academic year program working with UC Berkeley graduate students. So if you are particularly an underrepresented student in certain populations, it's good to look into that program. You can really get some good one-on-one mentoring support. So definitely look into that program if you think you might be eligible. And then of course the Career Center. So they have career mail, graduate school workshops, their graduate school fair. They will have the Master's and PhD Career Fair on October 15th from 12 to 4 p.m. And they'll also have a law school fair later in the month. So those are both some fairs to look at. I think they have a law and business, I believe, fair later in the month. So definitely look into those. And more info for how to sign up for that is on Handshake. Then for other useful tools, you'll want to create a study plan. So generally it's good to potentially study with 3 months out, and it shouldn't necessarily be a full-time job for those 3 months, but it's good to potentially spread out your practice over 3 months, because this really isn't a test that you can cram for very easily. So it's good to have some time to absorb the information and take enough practice tests. Also use a test book, try the library. There are some libraries now that are open for you checking out books. They have a lot of books available at most libraries. And if specifically you could use the Educational Testing Service and their website, I find that I like their book because they both have written the test. And especially for the verbal section, I found that that one was most close to the test itself. You'll especially want to make sure for your test book that within the verbal reasoning section, that both the passage-based questions and the vocabulary-based questions are of equal difficulty, because that's what you will find on the test itself. And they also have a number of free resources. So they have their test prep guides with Power Prep Online. They have their pool of argument and issue essay topics. And there's also a number of other practice tests. So this is one website that's pulled together a few practice tests, but again, EOP has also listed a few in their resource. Another one that I personally used was the Magoosh vocabulary app. It's great for learning vocabulary and making sure you continue to remember the vocabulary that you've practiced already. And it'll continue to give you new words and work on reviewing and learning new words at the same time. And then we also had some questions ahead about other ways to get reduced cost. So if you are in the military, if you look into this Dante's program, they have more information about reduced cost programs and also other support for applying to graduate programs for military members. And then there's also the ETS fee reduction request. So you can, in addition to getting a fee certificate reduction through the EOP website, if you aren't necessarily with EOP but you believe you should qualify, you could go there for a fee reduction request, and that is based off of financial need. And then here we have a question, does it cost the same amount each time you take it? Yes. And you should also be aware that it not only costs the same if you decide to cancel the test, there will be potentially a rescheduling fee or a cancellation fee. It will not be the full price of the test, you will get some money back, but there will be some fees for that. So that is something to keep in mind. And then one other thing to keep in mind is the GRE is only part of your application. So research, letters of rec, statement of purpose, GPA, those are all more important to your application. And it's also something to be aware of that a high score will not necessarily get you into a program, but a low score could keep you out of a program. So they generally do not weight the GRE very heavily. If you get a 170, that's not going to automatically get you into any of these selected programs. They're not looking at just the GRE itself, and it's not like the SAT where if you score a perfect score, that's a huge plus to them. They already know the reputation of your school at Berkeley. They're looking much more than at your GPA and these other components of your application. But if you get an uncharacteristically low score that isn't average or on par with their other applicants, that could be a determiner that keeps you out of a program. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you don't necessarily have to stress too much about the GRE itself, but you do want to score at least average with your peers applying to that program. And then for other information for test day, if you're at home, be sure to have Chrome or Firefox installed on your computer, have the test browser installed, do the ProctorUse system check, have your ID, mirror, whiteboard, and erasable marker ready. That whiteboard and erasable marker, that's how you'll actually do your scratch work. So since this is all on the test, it's all on a computer, there isn't necessarily a scratch work on the computer itself. You're using that with your whiteboard. So to do math problems or other notes for your essays, that's all on your whiteboard. And then clear your surrounding area of any materials that aren't approved during the test. Don't wear any jewelry or metal necessarily, and wear appropriate clothing. Your image will be shared with the institutions you apply to. And then, of course, even with all that said, try to relax before the test and get yourself in a good mindset for the test. Then if you're at a center, again, have your ID ready, potentially backup forms of ID if they have issues verifying the first one. Wear a mask. Those are required at most centers, if not all. Don't wear any jewelry or metal. They will potentially put you through a wand to check for any metal on a testing center, so keep that in mind. Bring a snack. You do get some breaks, especially between some of the sections, and there is a longer break where you could take a snack, take a longer bathroom break, so just bring a snack for that. And arrive 30 minutes before your test starts. You might not be able to get in at the exact scheduled time of your test, but they'll be at the centers, they'll be taking people for the TOEFL or all sorts of other exams. So as soon as the computer is available, that might be when they're looking for you to do the test, and it'll also take some time to get checked in. And then, of course, again, try to relax at the center. You might have a few minutes to collect your thoughts, but try to relax before the start of the test. And then, are there any other questions? I think we covered most of them. And then generally for all this, definitely the most important for practice would be to do some practice tests for the essays. If you can get feedback from others, that's great. Practicing with a friend can be great for those, especially to get some feedback, and also to look at some sample responses. Those are also available on the EastTS website, some sample responses. For the verbal section, studying vocabulary, root words is great. That's really the main part that you can cram, especially right before. But if you're doing root words, that could help you to generally figure out what some of the words mean, without necessarily knowing all the definitions. And then some general advice again for the whole test is read over each question very carefully and really work on also your timing as you take more practice tests. Looks like we have a couple of questions here. At the career fair, what's the most important takeaways, purposes of the fairs? So those are the fairs that I mentioned for graduate and other programs, like masters, PhDs. Those are telling you about different programs that are available to you. So assuming that you're taking the GRE, you're probably interested in going to one of those programs. Those will tell you about some of the schools that they have worked with, schools that specifically are looking to recruit Berkeley students. You can meet with them and also learn more about some other preparation you might want for those schools. And then how many months in advance do you have to register? You don't necessarily have to register months in advance. Remember, you can register potentially even 2 days before the exam. Just keep in mind that if you wait to do that, you might not be able to get your first choice of location. And especially for the at-home, I'm not sure how far out you might have to do that. I would say at least a couple of weeks, depending on the availability of the proctor system. You would probably want to register in advance. Any other questions? Okay, we have a question here. Sophomores interested in graduate school, but they don't know which schools they would like to attend. How should they filter through schools? Yeah, so I can get into that question with the next slide. If there's any other questions, feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A, but also if you could fill out the evaluation, that would help with other things that we might want for future presentations, as well as for working on this particular presentation. So for the rest of the people in the audience, if you could fill out this evaluation, that would be appreciated. I'll put it in the chat now as well. And then let me know if this doesn't work out. I'll try typing it again. So to answer the other question that came in, if you're interested in graduate school but you're not sure, I would say it's good to potentially look through other programs and look at some programs you might be interested in. Generally, to try to think of what these programs might offer. If you're just thinking you're generally interested in graduate school, it's good to narrow it down to a particular field first, but then definitely in maybe your junior or senior year going to one of these fairs and seeing what some of the total programs are that are available, and potentially networking with some of these programs would be good. For some programs, they are looking at potentially a demonstrated interest. So going and meeting with recruiters at a fair, meeting with other people from those schools can both be a great thing to mention in your applications, but they also might be collecting data on you. So if you've reached out, you've connected with people, that shows a good demonstrated interest in those schools. So those are 2 ways to generally prepare for graduate school. For preparing for the GRE, you can use those resources we mentioned. Definitely start with those Berkeley resources, especially those programs, since some of those are a year or so or more. So those would be great places to start. But also you can always start with getting a test prep book and seeing what some of the questions are. I would say the test isn't necessarily, they're not hard questions, just particularly tricky, and it takes some time to work on practicing them.